Mr. Osborn, Mr. Sheena, Mr. Konishi, Mr. Kashima, members of the council, guests and friends, it's a pleasure to welcome you this evening. I should tell our guests that this is a unique audience which you have. There's the effete of the Eastern establishment, and there are those who turn up on an evening like this in Baltimore. One of my colleagues remarked to me that the Japanese think that Americans have not yet learned to endure. And it's relative, of course, but for Baltimore to come on an evening like this is an endurance of a kind. Mr. Kashima remarked that we should have had hot sake instead of our wine, and if we had only planned better, we could have done that. We're happy that Mr. Osborn is joined by some of his colleagues. Mr. Sheena is president of the Sword Computer Corporation, which is an entrepreneurial success story in Japan of great interest, and two of his colleagues, Mr. Konishi and Mr. Kashima. I'm welcoming you this evening on behalf of the Baltimore Council, on behalf of the World Trade Center Institute, with which we cooperate extensively, and the Japan Society of New York, which is dedicated to encouraging close relations between the United States and Japan on both the economic and political levels. We thank the Westinghouse Corporation this evening for our reception, and I remind all of you that next week on February 6th, hopefully on a more pleasant evening, Secretary of the Navy Lehman will be our guest. That program will be held at the Convention Center. For those of you who wish to come to dinner beforehand, there's a reception at 5:15, a dinner at 6, and then he will speak at 7:30. And you have the option of coming just to the address or dinner plus the address. All of you have been introduced to Mr. Osborn by means of our flyer. Let me very quickly note that he has degrees from the University of the Redlands, from Edinburgh, and from Christ's College at Cambridge University. He's held a number of interesting posts. He's been an assistant to the director of the U.S. Census Bureau. He's been a social science analyst for the Commerce Department, a director of the Research Center at Krannert School of Management. He's been the director of legislative and regulatory affairs for TRW Information Services. He's been the senior policy analyst for governments at TRW, and he's been a fellow on the President's Commission on Executive Exchange. Within those positions, he's had a number of responsibilities, but among those which catch one's attention most readily are serving as economic attaché for high technology at the U.S. Embassy in Tokyo and senior policy analyst for governments at TRW. Mr. Osborn is a highly respected student of not only matters of technology, but Japan as well. His topic tonight is Japanese High Technology Policy, a Legislative and Regulatory Update. It gives me a great deal of pleasure to welcome Mr. Osborn to the Council. Mr. Osborn.
Well, I'm very, very flattered that you would come out on a night like this, or at least a night that was beginning the way it appeared to be beginning when I landed here at 4 o'clock with Sheena-san and my other colleagues. And the pilot had told us we were going to be delayed 30 minutes holding over your fair city. And he had also said that we were going to have a heavy chop, and this had gone on and on and on. Sheena-san has the ability to sleep on planes. I, unfortunately, on short flights don't. And so I was waiting for the usual bumpity bump, which never came, and we landed, and now it's cleared up. And so thank you very much for coming. And I have a task before me tonight, which has been made more complex by the council, by your hosts, because as we were riding in from the airport, I was told something about you. And it rather was perplexing to me, to say the least. I was told that there were a number of you who were more or less amateur students of history. Some of you were very serious about it, but that you had a concept of the past, and you were very interested in how that would all be tied together with Japan and high technology and things today. And I was told there was another group of you that had tremendous senses of humor and didn't like dull, boring, historic type analysis. And then I was told there was a group of people, and this is probably where the Westinghouse connection. Where is the Westinghouse connection tonight? Is Westinghouse physically in the room?
There are some of us here.
Okay, great, because later on I can thank Westinghouse many, many times for the excellent work they do in Japan on some of the subjects we're going to be talking about. But let me hold that back. But I was also told that there was a group that just wanted the hard facts and the legislative report. So I was tossed into my hotel room. I was looking at the speech that I had prepared, and I said, what am I going to do? So I said, I'll do 3 introductions and see if I can make everyone happy. You can figure out which ones are which if you so desire. What I'd like to do, and this is something I usually close presentations within our company, because we've become very interested in how we should be more active in Asia, is I'll give you as an introduction, I will give you the historic reference with which we usually close presentations these days to get everyone upset. It would say, we take it a little paraphrase from a recent bestseller. We say the one side came to the field with some of the most modern equipment. They had excellent intelligence. They had a very unified chain of command. They had a society that was pointed at a single goal. On top of that, they had incredible good luck. The other side, regrettably, had outdated equipment, a decentralized chain of command. It lacked discipline, had extremely poor intelligence, and when the intelligence arrived accurately, it was disregarded. And that side had extremely poor luck. That's introduction number 1 for our historians in the group. To go to a lighter vein, I will tell you a little story, which I heard the other day about our president and the Prime Minister of Japan, who were golfing in Hokkaido on the last presidential visit to that country. And Yasu, as he is known, at least in the press when they want to talk about our President Ron, Yasu slices one into the forest. Ron tees up, and his ball goes right into exactly the same place. So they're climbing around in the forest, and Secret Servicemen and everything else, and suddenly they see this immense Hokkaido bear lumbering in their general direction. Nakasone-san, not to be deterred, immediately whops open the golf bag, throwing the golf shoes up in the air, and putting on the tennis shoes. Reagan, obviously being an astute observer of human and animal instincts, says, Yasu, don't do that. Don't you know bears are one of the fastest animals on the face of the earth? They can outrun any man. Nakasone-san says, all I have to do is outrun you. Third, for those of you from Westinghouse that just want the hard facts. In fact, your president of Westinghouse KK will be giving some of these hard facts in Hawaii this weekend at the U.S.-Japan Businessman's Conference. So one should give credit where credit is due that Roger Nichols will be making some of these very points. But hard facts as part of an introduction. I can tell you that there is a new NTT, Nippon Telegraph and Telephone, being formed, legislative and high technology put together. On April 1st of 1985, the marketplace, in some senses, will become open in Japan for American telecommunications equipment. At the minimum, there will be more competition in Japan, and U.S. firms will have an opportunity to compete in that new market in a way they have not been able to up until now. But, there is always a but. All history, for those of you who liked introduction number 1, is ringed with a series of buts. And that is that the Ministry of Posts and Telecommunications, that coincidentally controls Nippon Telephone and Telegraph, the public monopoly in Japan, is drafting its own set of regulations, which will dictate what American and Japanese firms are allowed to do in this new environment. Well, all of us being used to regulation in our country would say, I suppose, so what? Seems perfectly reasonable that a government authority should do that. Well, this government authority, for reasons that are beyond the realm of comprehension sometimes, chooses not to show its draft regulations to the foreign business community, but on an ad hoc basis, in fact, discloses them to their major Japanese companies. And this is a major tussle at the moment, and we can talk more about it in the course of the presentation. But suffice it to say, there is a but about the new NTT. We can also say that in the course of the last year, the MITI, the Ministry for International Trade and Industry Software Rights Bill, which was called confiscatory by every major American computer corporation, was defeated. It was defeated. It never even reached the Diet. It was so unreasonable. We can tell you that, too. But there is a but. MITI is now taking its case to international forums and working in the time-honored way that MITI has worked since the Second World War in building a consensus, both domestically and internationally, that the type of legislation it's proposing, which would remove the protections of copyright from software, should in fact become the norm for Japan and perhaps for other parts of the world. We can also say that the legislation under which much of research and development in Japan was promoted through the Ministry of International Trade and Industry is ending. It is, in fact, ceases to be, I believe, sometime in 1985. So one could argue no longer will the government of Japan promote commercial research and development as distinct from military or public health and safety. Again, unfortunately or fortunately, depending on what side of the coin one wants to look at, we have a but. And that is that the ministry is, of course, drafting new legislation to run another 10, 12, whatever length of time is necessary, and proposing new funding, again, primarily focused at commercial R&D. This time they've been good enough to circulate the broad outlines of the proposal. And lastly, just as an example, although I suspect there are other examples like this if one wanted to look carefully, we can say that the Japanese companies and their government are proposing a $100 million plus program for machine-generated software. And you can say again, so what? Why shouldn't they be able to do that? And I'm not sure they shouldn't, incidentally. But the one thing I can tell you is that it's totally focused at commercial purposes, and the program that we have that would be the counterpart of that is totally focused at military purposes. It creates, perhaps at best, a disequilibrium. 3 introductions for the sake of argument. I love this podium that's like being at sea, but at any rate, can we make it go up? Like we made this high technology. Okay. We can also take bets on if I can keep all the papers on the rostrum the entire time. Now, normally, had I had another way that I was going to introduce this, I would have asked how, and it would help me in terms of what I'm going to say next, how many of you have ever been to Japan? Could I just see a show of hands? So it's a dangerous group of people, to say the least. But there's always another question. How many of you have actually lived in Japan? Okay, now the number starts to wane. Good. I can handle numbers under a dozen. Okay, the thing that I have to say, which all the people that live there would know all too well, is that everything in Japan is relative. I can make a list, which is what I intend to do. But I want it understood from the outset that it's a relative list. If I say the Japanese incentivize commercial technology, it doesn't mean we don't. But I would argue, and I think I can make a very good argument about it, that they do it more directly, that they do it more successfully, and that the outcome or the result is considerably more effective, right? And so as I talk, recognize that I know too that we do many of the things that are on this list. But I always remember this one meeting we were having with one of our employees, one of our Japanese employees, and he threw down his pointer and he said, "I am so tired of all of you saying Japan Inc." And I thought to myself, I've been here 2 days and I haven't heard anybody say it. And at any rate, he said, "We don't. The government of Japan, no one," Shina-san knows this, "no one likes the government of Japan. They're a lodestone around Japanese industry's neck." And we talked about it later after we had a few sakis. And actually, it wasn't sake because we too were not completely prepared for the necessity at hand. But at any rate, we talked about it, and basically, it was a relative thing. His government was much more cooperative with him than our government was with us. And we were in much more of an adversarial situation than he was. But from his perception, his government wasn't all that hot either. So having put the big caveat up front, that what I'm going to say is relative, I think for those of you that haven't lived in Japan or haven't visited Japan, there are some general points that if I'm going to talk about legislation or regulation or high technology or try to answer your questions, I have to make. The list, unfortunately, or fortunately, as the case may be, is not short. I think you have to understand some things going in about the Japanese people in order to appreciate the situation that they might be in and recognize that I'm not trying to be overly critical or the like of what I say when I come to the legislation or when I come to the machinations that surround the legislation. Number one, you've got a people, 120 million people, that are absolutely unique on the face of the earth. It's a common culture, it's a common language. It doesn't exist anywhere else in the world. And that can begin to create a phenomena, which as I give you the little list, the phenomena becomes rather strong, I think. No one else in the world is Japanese except the Japanese. It is not like our Anglo-Saxon culture. It is not like our Slavic culture. It is unique in the world. It is today, as it has been for 1,000 years, an extremely high civilization. And the people who are Japanese perceive themselves as an extremely high, if not the highest, civilization. Coupled with that is an issue of size. And if we could do it, which we can't, but I guess I can use my hands, what I would say is this. If you take Japan, Japan is smaller than California. So Japan fits inside California when you crunch it down. And you say, so what? I know that. But if you take a little line and draw it from San Luis Obispo to San Diego, California, and then go 50 miles inland, only 50 miles, so that's not even the distance from Los Angeles International Airport to San Bernardino, California, and draw that line back up to San Luis Obispo, 75% of all the Japanese people live within that rectangle, that very, very tiny rectangle. That has tremendous implications for society. That means all the headquarters of all the major companies are inside that red rectangle. That's like taking New York, Cincinnati, Cleveland, every other major city in the United States, and smashing them into Los Angeles County and saying, now all the headquarters are going to be there, all the major research laboratories are going to be there, all the major universities are going to be in that tiny rectangle. The seat of government is going to be, for the entire country, is going to be in that little tiny red rectangle. It changes. It's a phenomena that even people who live in Japan, as outsiders or as Japanese, cannot fully grasp. It creates a different dimension of time, distance, and interpersonal relationships, and all of you who have lived there know a great deal about the interpersonal relationships of our Japanese friends. That makes the society extremely different. Now, having said those two things, we have to remember that it's a resource-poor country. It imports all of its raw materials. It imports much of its agriculture, though in some areas it has, over the last few years, become independent. Turn now from those sort of realities that the Japanese people have to live with, for better or worse, and look at some of the basic, just general facts about the country. Too corporate, I guess. They have an educational system that's unique in the world. If you can get into university, you virtually cannot flunk out. We have a little problem in our company sometimes recognizing, our general managers sometimes have a problem recognizing that all the Japanese read English. All educated Japanese people read English. All educated Japanese people speak English to one extent or another. And with all deference to Shina-san and his colleagues, I would also say that they choose when they will speak English, unless they're forced into the international business setting. I've ridden with someone that you know very well, with Sato-san of Mitsubishi Denki, the head of their semiconductor operations worldwide. I was with him twice. I said, well, he seems like a nice man, but he certainly doesn't speak English. It was nice of him to pick me up in the car, and my goodness, he stumbled over those one or two words, but since I don't speak Japanese, I'm really surprised that, he would take this much time with me. Third time I met him, he spoke English just fine. He decided he was going to speak English to me. No, on all three occasions, there was no audience. It was simply a function of whether he chose or not chose to speak English based on whether he liked my face or not. And that's probably really what it comes down to. So you have a system in which a university graduate that has done halfway well at university, well, it doesn't matter whether he's done well or not, or she has done well or not. They've been exposed to 10 years of English. You do 6 before you get to university. You do 4 in it, and you pass a comprehensive exam in it. And one of the things I found is I can go to places where people have not used English, but we can write on a blackboard to each other, and they will communicate if there's a reason. So you have a country that has cultivated a second language for emergency purposes or otherwise, and then, of course, with some people, it's a business, part of their business. You also have a situation where a great number of the Japanese people, now particularly, but for some time really, have studied overseas. If you look at the graduate students studying in the United States today, there have been estimates, although they are just estimates, and maybe it's a better way to put it, is guesstimates, that almost 75% of the Japanese graduate students studying in the United States today are financed by Japanese companies directly. It's no secret. It's not done clandestinely. In fact, I'll put a footnote right here. Virtually nothing in Japan is done clandestinely. It's all above board if you want to look and find it and study about it. But at any rate, about 75% is a good guess. You go into a Japanese company after you graduate, you do well as an engineer, you will be sent again to get an advanced degree. You will have an option for certain selected people to study overseas. And so a significant cadre of those graduate engineers at our universities are in fact funded by their parent companies. They've had the same ruling party for 35 years. The politics of the party are dominated by, to a great extent, some say dominated, but I'll say to a great extent, by agricultural and rural interests that sometimes conflict with the very high technologies that are being pushed, such as electronics and biotechnology, by the major corporations. There is obviously a close cooperation between government and industry. It's a parliamentary system. In Japan, anything that reaches the floor of the Diet, with 1 or 2 exceptions each session, controversial exceptions, will pass because it's already been agreed. And it's just like the English system. It'll pass because there's a majority party. Under the heading of government and industry, there's a strange note. Rather than regulation, industrial growth. Yes. One of the things that you can certainly say that the Japanese do, and do well, is they believe in industrial growth rather than regulation for the sake of regulation. Good example is the automobile industries in our 2 countries. The Japanese have also addressed the issue of pollution. When they got around to addressing it for whatever reasons, one of the questions that was put forward was, well, we're going to have certain pollution standards. Okay? Do we do it, each company go out and do their own? Or do we have the companies work as a consortium? Because after all, pollution standards are not part of competition. The government has mandated a standard, so let's have it. So the automobile industries were told that the antitrust laws would be waived. Theirs are very different than ours. And go get their cars so they met the pollution standard. When our automobile industry went before Congress with almost exactly the same proposal some years ago, they were told absolutely not. You all do your own R&D. We don't rationalize research and development in this country. It is a paternalistic relationship between industry and government rather than an adversary. Sometimes industry is the paterfamilias, sometimes government. As I said, law is made before it reaches the Diet. And probably one of the most important and interesting things from the point of view of talking about high technology legislation is that last year, according to a man I really respect, Everett Rogers, in his recent book on Silicon Valley, and we've talked about it, so I suspect he has the facts to back it up, he says the Japanese government spent $30 million in Washington, D.C. lobbying the federal government of the United States. I think it's an interesting number. I suspect it's not far off. There's over 100 registered lobbyists representing the Japanese government or Japanese industry. Excuse me if I said Japanese government by a sub. Japanese government and industry. The United States, on the other hand, you might say, okay, well, what's the story on the other side? Does the United States lobby in Tokyo? If we're lobbying in Tokyo, I don't think Westinghouse or TRW or General Electric or IBM know much about it. And there are very few, if any, American companies that contribute, even if they're registered as Japanese companies, very few that contribute to Japanese electoral campaigns. I would be willing to say, without a blink, that the total amount contributed by American companies and their subsidiaries is under $1 million US. This is the above-board bona fide contributions that can be made legally. And I'm sure that's all there is in the case of American companies. If you said, on the other hand, cynics. Well, you're from Baltimore. I used to have to represent TRW in your state legislature, so I can understand all the laughs. I once testified before Senator McGurk. Is there a Senator McGurk? Yes. Interesting man. I was right ahead in my testimony, which had to do with consumer credit, of your oyster, some sort of fishermen that dig. And they were all there in their boots, and they looked very angry. So I remember that. Back to Japan. Over 100 now, you say, okay, well, suppose Osborn's wrong about the numbers. I don't think I am wrong. In fact, I think it's very close. We don't, that I don't know anybody else that does either, make contributions, even though it's legal to make. I mean, there is a whole structure under which you could do it, but it's just not done. Because nobody is sure how to do it or what to do or the like. But even if you said, okay, we'll put that aside, are there people assigned to do government relations? You all know right down the road there's, 100,000 lobbyists and government relations specialists from companies and associations and education. In all of Tokyo, now I can promise you this number is right, there are only 3 people assigned the full-time task for American companies of doing lobbying / legislative / information gathering connected with the government of Japan process. Full-time Americans that I'm aware of, and I hope I know about them if they're around, because probably we need a lot more. We do need a lot more. Now, on the other hand, in the United States, the government of Japan now, not corporation, has over 100 trained officers that are here to assist their industry in doing business in the United States. There are JETRO officers. There are Nippon Telephone and Telegraph officers in New York, in Silicon Valley. They are there to assist. There are 6 or 7 JETRO offices. JETRO is an arm of MITI, the Ministry of International Trade and Industry, and they are spread around the United States. There are MITI officers spread around the United States. This is not counting the MITI officers and the other government of Japan officers that are attending our major universities. All well and good. The only point I'd like to make is that there's less than 10 Americans in Japan doing the counterpart work to promote U.S. trade and industry. 15 if you want to stretch a point. And that's to include the agricultural officers in the American embassy. Now, we have obviously a large embassy, but much of the embassy is not devoted to promoting commercial purposes. So, let me say that things are, at least in a sense, a little out of whack. I had written a little quote, and it said, Millions for commercial purposes, not 1 yen for defense. Not exactly true. In fact, the government of Japan, and one can cite some numbers, has, within the rules that we helped lay down for the government of Japan during the occupation, and not just rules, but the cultural inhibitions against rearming, has done relatively well. The problem, in a nutshell, is that all of the money that is spent in Japan for high technology is spent for commercial development. The government's money does not go, and perhaps it shouldn't, perhaps ours shouldn't. So we're only talking and we're only creating a structural set of differences. But at any rate, it doesn't go for military purposes, it goes for commercial research and development, and it's pushed and funneled and channeled by the government of Japan. There are special tax incentives. We have a government today, again, perhaps rightfully so, that says we shouldn't have special tax incentives. I've always been a little perplexed by this, but at any rate, my understanding is that we shouldn't have special tax incentives, we shouldn't have an industrial policy, we shouldn't incentivize one industry over another. Well, all I can say is that the Japanese have decided that they should take a very different approach, which we all know has been relatively successful. So they have a special tax incentive for companies that will install robotics. And they've renewed it again this past year. So on top of all the other depreciation incentives, they have a special tax incentive. They have a special tax incentive to address the problem that they don't have what is called general purpose software. That's software that TRW could buy and Westinghouse could buy, and we both could use roughly off the shelf, as distinct from special purpose software that's just developed for us. So they have a special program. It looks amazingly exactly like a U.S. Department of Defense set aside for military purposes, but this is used, of course, for commercial purpose. They have the groupings of companies which those of you that have visited or lived there know a great deal about, but basically they have concentrated mass, particularly in the high technology areas. There are a few companies, they dominate the field. There are groupings of companies, and those companies, while I won't bore you with all the little notes I'd made, suffice it to say that they have Mitsubishi Group, which is 32 core companies, has $152 billion in annual sales, and their chief executive officers meet once a month and discuss major issues. Trust me, those of you that don't already know, that permeates down into all sorts of implications. And that repeats itself then within the Sanwa group, within the Mitsui group. That cohesive, gigantic, titanic almost, mass. I mean, IBM is what, 60 billion US annual sales? Most of us are in the $6 billion to $12 billion range. It's an interesting country too, because it's a land without lawyers. My host didn't introduce me as a lawyer, and I'm not a practicing lawyer, but I've gone to law school, suffered through it twice, in fact, and it's a country that has fewer lawyers than the city of Boston. It's a nice place, and it really is. It really is. And I got to tell you a story, because it's a good story, and we won't name the company, but it's a very big company, and we haven't said their name yet tonight. American company. It was about a year ago, and they were finishing up the negotiations on a very large contract with an agency of the government of Japan. And I was at the embassy at the time, and I was going to go home for the night, and sure enough, so-and-so calls, and he says, I have a terrible problem. And I said, how can you have a problem? Your company has just pulled off the greatest coup, and we've been talking about it for days. He said, well, it's not over yet. Our attorneys have got involved. He says, they have sent me a 198-page document, which they want me to take to this particular agency and give to them and get them to agree that this should become part of our agreement. And I said, gee, you're all through if you do that. And he says, well, what should I do? And I said, well, I'm not the first person to talk to, because he told me who he talked to. I said, I already know what they said. They said, go to your chairman, call him up, get on a plane, do whatever you have to do, but convince him to take the 2-page document that particular Japanese government agency had offered him as their letter of intent. That if he had to, hand in the 191-page document, but say, I, as the manager of this operation, as the chief negotiator or whatever, don't accept this as valid, but if you'd like to look at it and just think about these points, and perhaps later on when we structure the final agreement, we can have this. Well, he managed to find the power in his company which said take the 2-page agreement, and they did take the 2-page agreement. And at this time, year and a half or whatever it is later, that company feels that although they have since written up certain, they've never got to even 100 pages, I understand, additional clauses and the like, they feel that the original document sufficed. So it's a very different process in that country. And lawyers are not welcome. American lawyers can't practice there. They have to work. They can't have Japanese lawyers work for them. They can't have their own law offices. It's a very interesting system. It's probably one of the wisest systems I've ever seen at that point. Unions, in many cases, are an arm of management, except for a couple of the national unions connected with civil service aspects of the civil service and the railway. The unions are highly compartmentalized and localized. There's limited job mobility. Basically, although you may have heard this phrase lifetime employment, basically only about 1/3 of the Japanese people were covered by lifetime employment, and they're basically in these big groupings of companies. Subcontractors aren't so lucky. There is, though, a very high flexibility of the workforce. There was a gentleman, who's a chemistry professor here. And I go around before these things and try to find all the true professors and academics, so I won't step on their subjects. But at any rate, I'll take a risk here on the chemistry subject. When I say flexibility of the workforce, it's incredible. I was down in Kyushu at a semiconductor plant, and I was asked if I'd like to go to a subcontractor. So we trundled off to the subcontractor. Very modern facility, about 150 people working just like bees, all in the clean rooms and in their costumes. This was a back-end semiconductor plant, so it wasn't terribly complex. If you haven't seen a semiconductor plant, it looked terribly complex, right out of Star Wars. So they said, "Do you know what this plant used to be?" And I thought, some form of simple electronics. I put out my best answer. They said, "No, it was a silkworm growing plant. And all these people 8 months ago, all of these people were growing silkworm larvae." That's what they did. And this was Mitsubishi, and they deserve credit where credit's due. Mitsubishi Denki, and this is Kanebo Kikuchi Denki. They took all of these people and retrained them. All of them. And now they were running relatively complex machinery, relatively complex, and on top of that they knew how to repair it, to keep the downtime to a minimum, and the like. They were highly retrainable. And incidentally, that was the 180 or whatever that had worked in the silkworm larva growing plant. They got another 60 farmers out of the fields and trained them too. It's a highly flexible workforce. I think the Americans that work there never cease to be amazed at how flexible the workforce is. The American presence in Japan, and this will explain a lot about what I will quickly rush to. The American presence in Japan is very limited. Our investments, about a year ago in Japan, our total investments were less than our total investments in Belgium. Yet Japan is the next to the United States, for most American corporations, it's the largest single country market in the world for most American corporations. That doesn't mean that they're successful in it. It just means that potentially it is. And for many companies, I can recite a number, which I would think would include NCR, IBM, Burroughs as 3 examples. That is their largest single country market after the United States, although, of course, Western Europe taken as a whole is bigger. Okay. So the American presence is limited. How is it limited? Investment is limited. It's also limited in people on the ground, just literally management on the ground doing things. Our TRW structure is we have divisions, we have groups, we have sectors, and we have 3 sectors. A division ranges in annual revenues from $50 million to $200 million. My guess would be if you said TRW division general managers, how many of those type of people are there in Japan that work for American companies? So I would be very comfortable in saying if you exclude the banking industry and the oil industry. So now we'll talk about all manufacturers and all high technology. There's under 30 in Japan. It's a very low number, which then starts to replicate itself, and you'll see how this fits in when we come to the issue at hand. It starts to then get into the whole issue of how do you address a problem in a country that's connected with legislation or even a labor union problem? How do you address these different problems? Do you have staff to address them? Do you have people that are trained? Do you have people that can communicate back to the United States even? It's very difficult. I put it down, and I think it's worth saying that there is another problem from the other side, because obviously the answer would be, why don't you hire Japanese people to do these things? Obviously, American companies do hire Japanese people to do these things. But the society and the culture has a definite bias against Japanese people who work for foreign firms. There is even a term used to describe such people. It's not used as much these days as it was 10 years ago, and I'm sure it'll continue to diminish in its use. But the point is, working for foreigners isn't necessarily a good thing. We probably helped create that phenomena, but it's not solely an American or French or an English phenomena. And 2 points left, and then we'll talk about the legislation. One is, Japan is definitely a country that can innovate. If one more person writes one more article about how the United States is 5 to 7 years ahead in software and doesn't really look carefully at some of the things that are being done in Japan, or doesn't talk to the American computer companies who have set up software development centers there because they thought the talent was so excellent, then I'm going to roll over and start crying. The vapor axle deposition process, which is a new way of making fiber, which the people that make fiber in this country say is unique, was invented in Japan. 75% of the world's research in gallium arsenide, which is the core of high-speed computer circuits, or will be shortly, is done in Japan. Over 75%. Probably 95% of the non-military work in gallium arsenide is done in Japan. CMOS technology, which is what low power consumption, which is now very vital to our military, because you want something small and you don't want it to have a big battery or a big power source. CMOS technology is extremely advanced in Japan. So, put all that together, and then for the historians, we add the following. They are definitely a country that has read von Clausewitz. And if they haven't read von Clausewitz and it was Bismarck they were supposed to have read, that's fine. But maximum mass concentrated at the point of greatest weakness. Many of the high technology problems we have had with Japan, the industry, and Japan, the government, is because they have taken very narrow niches of technology and done extremely well in them. They have not chosen to spread themselves across whole ranges of technology. That creates a surplus sometimes in the country. It allows them to drive down the world price of certain products. It disrupts the planning of the more traditional American corporations, which are planning on a 2 to 5 year cycle on return at a certain fixed rate. At any rate, with all that in mind, and I at least have to tip my hat to them, they have the Ministry of International Trade and Industry. You have many, many authors in this country who debate whether MITI does anything or not. All I can say is it seems to me that they do a great deal and do it well. Perhaps they don't do as much as some of the authors saw them doing 10 years ago. But now, government programs. What kind of government programs? What's this sort of government industry coalition in Japan doing on high technology, and how does legislation fit into this? Again, don't need to dwell on it, but simply to just tick them off. Fiber optics, major government program in fiber optics. Fiber optics and also optical devices. The devices that capture, store, throw the light down the fiber. Major programs in this area. Major programs in next generation integrated circuits, 5th generation computers, which you've all read about, but there's also a program in high-speed scientific computers. There's a program in machine-generated software, which I mentioned. NTT, Nippon Telephone and Telegraph, has parallel work going in all these fields along with the government work. Now you may say to me, Okay, again, so what? Big deal. All the major Japanese corporations that are the leaders in these fields are involved in the research. How does it differ from our research? If we were going to say anything, it differs in two ways from our government industry research. One, ours is focused on military applications. As one of my friends said recently, who's a scientist in this field, who needs a nuclear hardened TV set? You talk about our VISIC program. My Japanese friends said, oh, you're spending $300 million on VISIC. That's 3 times as much as we're spending. And then I say, but we're spending 80% of the money on nuclear hardness. It's not the same. But at any rate, the real essence is there is much less duplication in their research programs. Research and development in Japan is rationalized. They don't have Motorola, TRW, and Westinghouse working on the same narrow parts of semiconductor technology. They take the one who they say is the best, and they take the one who they say is the next best. They team them in a team approach. They go to the very next narrow slice of technology. They take the 2 guys that are good there. Sometimes it doesn't work. The old story. The auto industry, MITI, same people I'm talking about that do a lot of this high technology rationalization. MITI only wanted, I think it was 2 automobile companies. All the Japanese corporations that wanted to build automobiles said, go put it in the Brahmaputra or somewhere. And at any rate, we have 11 Japanese automobile companies today. So again, don't want to it's unsafe to generalize, and it's all relative. One of the things that we did in TRW a few months ago was we took all the Japanese research and development programs. I got told to do it. Other people get to look at the slide. So I put all this long list and all the amounts in US dollars up on the board. And we've been going through all these slides and getting all the good comments, and everybody's real happy. We get to this slide and there's silence, and I thought, oh geez, something's wrong. I said, you got the numbers wrong, Osborn. And so I look up and I said, geez, did I calculate the yen to the dollars wrong? And I look up and I said, no, those are the right numbers. No, those numbers are too low. Too low. So I said, well, those are the right numbers. He said, no one could do a program in optical devices for $80 million. This is a military side of our company. We also are a commercial company, and we have some very benign people in that part of the corporation. But these are the people who are working night and day to defend us. So they're sometimes a little testy when they think their time's being wasted. At any rate, the point is the Japanese spend about 25% to perhaps 1/3 what we spend on a comparable R&D project for a whole host of reasons. 2 years ago, in a presentation at the University of California at Los Angeles, one of the senior IBM scientists stated the cost of maintaining a PhD researcher in a Japanese lab, all things taken together, was about 2/3 the cost of maintaining them in a comparable U.S. laboratory setting. And the list of differences goes on, and when you stack them all up, plus the Japanese government's point of view that they aren't financing the whole program, some of the programs they ask for matching money from the companies, you get a much lower price tag than we get. And of course, you're all sitting there going, look at this dummy. He's talking about semiconductors when we got the $580 screwdriver. Okay, forget about that. And speaking generally, it's quite a lot less expensive to do things in Japan. I was going to give you 5 case studies, but I'm not. Instead, because I really do want to hear the questions, I'm going to jump right to just 2. Software and NTT. Had I had more time, I would have talked about very large-scale integrated circuits, satellites, and NTT procurement, which is a separate subject from the deregulation of NTT. Let me just talk to you for a couple minutes about the software issue in Japan. Last year, for reasons that are still known only to MITI proposed legislation, but you can't, they circulated within the ministry and within the other ministries, a piece of legislation that would have drastically altered the protections for software. Software is protected under copyright in the United States and in many other countries throughout the world, particularly industrialized countries. In fact, it's protected to the extent that it's protected in Japan by copyright, and even by some court cases. But MITI said, well, this is all well and good, but that's the education ministry, and really this should be, we handle computers, and really the protection should be here. And furthermore, how are we ever going to see IBM's source codes? That's probably being unkind, but that is generally what is said after a couple cups of sake by the Americans in Tokyo. And at any rate, they proposed a scheme, and it was very straightforward. All software would have to be registered. Okay. You say, well, so what? You file some sort of copyright. Well, copyright is not registration. Trademark law, you register. That's not so bad. They said all software, including the source code, would have to be deposited with MIDI. Well, even there is no such rule in the whole world at this time connected with software. One can safely say that. They said on top of that, MIDI will reserve the right to decide when there should be compulsory licensing. That is, someone wants to use software or already has a software program from another company, they modify it, now they want to sell it on the open market. And by the way, there won't be any appeal to the judicial system for this. Well, the thing to tell you that's different about the subject of software than many other examples that I could have given you of the government of Japan dealing in roughly an adversary relationship with foreign industry or foreign interests is they had forgotten, and I really think this is true, that unlike the semiconductor industry, the American semiconductor industry, which does not have a heavy presence in Japan, the American computer industry has been in Japan for 30 years. They have tens of thousands of Japanese employees, maybe 30,000 altogether if you count all the companies. They have several hundred, not several hundred, let's say 200 to 300 managers in country, foreign managers. They have staffs. Some of them have lawyers. And so they went through the ceiling when they heard this, and they fought it tooth and nail in Tokyo, not in Washington, D.C., not where you have to retain all the high-priced lobbyists, although they did fight it there too. But I think the difference was they fought it in Tokyo, and they were extremely successful. And at the cabinet meeting last February 19th, even though it took many months after this to completely kill the monster, or at least to kill it on a temporary basis, Prime Minister Nakasone told the various ministries that met and told MITI that they couldn't bring a proposal forward to the Diet that there wasn't a consensus on, and told them to go back and get a consensus, and they've been working very diligently ever since. They have announced informally that they don't plan to have a consensus in 1985. It doesn't mean they won't have it eventually. The American business community considers the software legislation, not just for computer companies, for Westinghouse as an industrial control company. Westinghouse and General Electric have both stated that they're very, very concerned about this issue. The Ministry of Posts and Telecommunications and NTT going to have the, quote, new NTT on April 1st. There's supposed to be the opportunity for American companies to participate very actively in the market. One of the problems is that no American company has yet to see the draft regulations that are going to implement the law. The American government has been asking for the draft regulations very politely, very firmly but very politely, for 8 months. They're told, well, we can't show them to you. I'll show you how ironic it is to do business in Japan. I was lucky enough to go to a meeting with 2 representatives of the U.S. Embassy and the chairman of Burroughs Japan, who represents the American business community in Japan as president of the American Chamber. And we sat down with the minister, Megumi Sato, of the Ministry of Posts and Telecommunications, and all his deputy ministers, and we had a nice chat for an hour, and he agreed that we could see the draft regulations. And if Mr. Heidi asked, Mr. Heidi being the Burroughs chap, if Mr. Heidi asked him once, he asked him 5 times to make sure it was okay, that we weren't mishearing. And we had basically said, how can we be informed or know what's going on if we can't see the draft regulations? And we had been asked if we would please come and testify on the new regulations, but we'd been told we couldn't see them. And that's really true. That is not a misstatement. I'm glad to go into more detail for those of you that are interested. Anyway, the minister says, it's fine. He talks to the vice ministers, and they say it's fine. This is all done in Japanese, but one of the embassy's people is fluent in Japanese. And so basically, they were surprised we hadn't seen it. We could pick that much up out of the conversation. Okay. The punchline is, we now go, Mr. Hasagawa of MPT is the designated representative to have the meeting where we get to see the regulations. So we say, we're ready, we're going to come over and see the regulations. He says, what regulations? Now really, this is true. This only happened last week. He says, we can't show you the regulations. And I said to him on the phone, of course his English is perfect, I said, you were in the room. The minister said we could see the regulations. He says, the minister doesn't understand. And I said, well, what doesn't he understand? He doesn't understand there aren't any regulations. I said, how can you promulgate into law the regulations on April 1st to guide this massive change and tell me they don't exist? And besides that, what I didn't tell him, and I won't say who it was because I don't want to put Shina-san at any disadvantage, is one of my former employees happens to work for a large telecommunications company now, and he has seen the draft regulations and keeps coming and talking to me about them. So I know they exist in detail, and I know companies have access to them, and it's just the way things are done. And one of the things that you've probably even seen, and I'm sure it's been in the press here because we see it in the press in Japan, is Nakasone has a sincere desire to see Japan become more liberal in a whole series of trade issues, not just high technology, and to become more responsive to some of the legitimate concerns of the United States, because there is such a massive disequilibrium that fairness may no longer be the question. Okay, he has that desire. I think the Minister Sato, clearly had the desire. He couldn't see logically why we shouldn't be able to see the regulations. But down in the bureaucracy, including the Eisenhower Scholars, which Mr. Hasegawa is just coming to the United States on an Eisenhower Fellowship, there is a great intransigence. They aren't going to show you anything that they don't have to show you. And until the minister personally walks down to the international section and kicks Mr. Hasegawa, he isn't going to show anything, because below him are whole cadres of bureaucrats who say, we're not going to show the gaijins anything, the foreigners anything. This isn't good for Japan. And they may be right. You know, it's easy to sound overly American, but if one wants to be objective, they have their point of view too, and they may be absolutely right. So, what are the conclusions tonight? Not all borne out by the evidence I presented, but nonetheless. I'd argue to you that U.S. companies and the United States government have extremely inconsistent policies toward Japan, particularly in the high technology area, and perhaps in the trade areas in general. We tell them on the one hand, we don't have any protectionist measures, but we set an automobile quota, an informal quota with. Then we tell them, well, we're going to lift the informal quota, but by the way, we want you to drop your quota on telecommunications, but maybe we won't lift our informal quota, but we don't bring them together in negotiating packages. A lot of the issues are negotiated very separately. We don't, as a group, American companies and the government, communicate well to our Japanese friends. So a lot of times, I suspect this is the first time Mr. Hasegawa has ever had a run for his money. Actually, it's the first time he's been receiving letters written in Japanese saying, Mr. Hasegawa, I don't understand why you can't do what the minister said, and he sees the CC to the minister at the bottom. So maybe we aren't communicating as well as we should. We found a year ago a lot of companies that were complaining to the Japanese government were still sending their letters in English. Today they're sending them in Japanese, because we found out what happens is that if you don't, even though people can read English, it's still not the easiest thing in the world, and who really wants to take the time? And we also found that if you don't hand carry every document to the people you want to read them, they never get to see them. Great phenomena, great phenomena. Probably no different than the United States. You're all going to say to me, anybody that's in sales or marketing is going to say, what a jerk, he should know that. But if you're not in sales and marketing, you don't necessarily know that, and some of this is a little different. Also, point 3, we have too few people on the ground in Japan, and we dedicated to trying to carry on these dialogues with the government of Japan, and there are literally no industry people, 2 or 3. And we place our efforts very much, too much, in Washington, D.C. We think we can solve the problems here in Washington. A lot of them have to be solved in Tokyo. And lastly, and in conclusion for the historians, I would just say that unless we carefully track, and this is just a serious note, and provide timely and articulate responses backed by legitimate pressure, nothing is going to change. The automobile industry of the United States, TRW is a major automotive parts supplier, has a famous saying. They say, the Japanese talk and they ship. And I really don't blame them. If I was Japan, the phenomena that I've described tonight, I would keep talking and I would keep shipping just as long as everybody would let me. So, I thank you for being so patient with me. Thank you for listening. I'd be glad to answer any questions for a couple minutes that you might have. Sure. So, let's take the gentleman in the green first.
Two-part question.
Oh.
First is how is their corporate tax compared to ours? Secondly, possibly tied to the first one, is that, at least the way I understand, is that most of their large corporations are public, it's owned by the workers rather than owned by shareholders. Like in here, you might take your company, for example, you have stock on the market, you sell it to people who have no knowledge of what you do, all they do is actually invest in your company. There, the employees themselves own the company, and they share the profit in it. That's the way I understand it.
Now, that would come as a great surprise to me. On the second question, no, I don't think, in fact, that's generally the rule. In fact, quite the contrary, the banks are major owners of many of the Japanese corporations, which is a significant difference from our own system. So that would answer your question number 2. But could I get you to just one more time quickly the first part?
How does their tax structure as far as corporate tax?
Yeah, their tax. If I'm not mistaken, and Shina-san, you should correct me on this. Your national tax at the corporate level takes more tax than the U.S. federal tax at the corporate level. So it is a heavier tax. Okay. This gentleman had a question.
Yes. You rather succinctly and briefly said legitimate pressure, or what did you say?
I said legitimate pressure. I hope I said legitimate.
Define it a little more clearly, because I don't know what is.
Yeah, it's
pressure,
always.
what pressure
This is the problem with an Anglo-Saxon education, I'm afraid, or an Oxbridge education. There is, believe it or not, and those of you that ever saw Neville Chamberlain know this all too well, such a thing as legitimate pressure. If you saw Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, there's no rules in a knife fight. And I guess what I would say is legitimate pressure, speaking as an individual, not as a representative of my company, would be as follows. If the telecommunications market in Japan remains closed to American companies, because as a matter of government policy, everything is done to obfuscate the process. And if Japanese companies are now at the range of selling $1 billion a year in telecommunications into the United States, which is basically an open system, and maybe if they're lucky, they're selling $100 million into Japan. Okay, I would say legitimate pressure simply says, until you clean that up, we're sorry. You can't sell into the United States. I think on a case-by-case basis. But that's speaking as an individual. I think that's legitimate, because you can document such a massive inconsistency. And I think it can be documented in terms of the rules and regulations that impede. In fact, there's a number of American companies who sell their equipment in Japan, but first they have to modify it, not to meet some sort of technical standard, but in fact to meet a regulatory standard that says only NTT may, the public monopoly, which is now NTT, may sell a piece of equipment that does these 3 things. If it is a private company, they may only do number 1 and number 2, even though these are incredibly simple things. Companies like Rome and some of the other telecommunications companies would have to speak to it. But legitimate pressure, I suppose, means actually doing something. The standing joke in the American community in Tokyo is that there is no way Japan is ever going to do anything or change anything unless they actually see that the United States as a country is going to take some action. Now, that's speaking as an individual, and I know that as an individual, I may be too narrow-sighted. That's just a personal feeling. I know our government has to weigh a lot of different issues, and we all do, including the defense of Northeast Asia, worldwide trade relations. Many other things have to come into the balance. So, but legitimate pressure could include things like Mr. Fowler, the Federal Communications Commission chairman, I guess, Mark Fowler, announced recently that they would in fact put Japanese equipment through the same levels of screening and the same types of tests that U.S. equipment was being put through in Japan. In other words, they would, in effect, treat them exactly identically to the way they were treating our equipment, which is much more strictly than we treat theirs. So that's an example. I don't know if that answers your question. Yes?
I enjoyed your speech very, very much. Not only informative, but your delivery was very excellent. I have many questions, but I'm going to keep my question to one, in just one comment. You mentioned that the Japanese government and the Japanese industry spend a lot of money here. Statistically speaking, probably 3 times more than the U.S. spends over there. 3 million here by the Japanese, maybe
30 million.
30 million.
30 million in Washington, D.C. alone. We didn't talk about how much they spend in Ohio.
Okay. Now, and then you mentioned, for instance, JETRO, Japan External Trade Organization, will help the U.S., the Japanese industries here to sell more things. I just want to correct the fact that they are actually helping right now the U.S. manufacturers to sell over there. So the U.S. government and the U.S. industry may not spend a whole lot, but actually Japanese government is spending some helping here, working on the behalf of the U.S. government interest and as well as the U.S. industry interest. Now my question.
I don't. But you got to tell them where they're sending you.
All right. Okay.
They're going to put you in Nagoya to help you.
Maybe you and I have to sit down and argue on that point. But I agree with you that a lot of our frictions that we have here are connected with the cultural things. You described Japan as being a very unique in many respects.
It is.
It's closed or whatever. I agree. And but again, also I think you mentioned that and I agree that many of our so-called national characteristics are rooted in the geographical features and so forth. Japan being an island society, and you mentioned that Japan doesn't have resources, totally dependent on resources outside. But now we're talking about high technology, say biotechnology, the sunrise industry. Many people say that solves a number of problems that we're going to have, hunger to whatever. Now, if Japan moves into the high technology area more and more, in biotechnology, medical, industrial, agriculture, and so forth, that country may not become so dependent on natural resources. Then, do you foresee perhaps in the future that mentality, which so much characterizes their business practices and so forth, may change accordingly?
Well, there is also when we have a few pops of sake, we talk about the fact that there is, we believe, we don't know this for a fact. This is probably being a little silly, but no, seriously, we do talk a lot about the self-sufficiency programs that the government of Japan has underway. That the biotechnology, some of them are directly related to food self-sufficiency, and there are goals that the nation be. There are goals, probably unattainable, but still attainable in the long run, for the nation to be self-sufficient by the year 2000. I would assume that would change how you do some things. I would assume also that if everyone keeps saying you ought to do more in the defense area, you ought to do more in the defense area, that eventually, and when I say everyone, if the United States government continues to say it, eventually Japan, I think within a lot of our lifetimes, will rearm. I think it's very straightforward. They will. But it changes, sure. If you become self-sufficient in food, it changes the way you think about how you view the rest of the world. If you I don't know how you become self-sufficient in raw materials, with a lot of raw materials that the heavy industries of Japan are based on, and the automobile industry are based on. But yeah, there's no reason why not. And my point was not, incidentally, to be critical of JETRO or any of the other agencies of the government of Japan that are here in this country to help them. And they may also do some things in connection with Americans wanting to do business in Japan. My point was simply to say that we don't have a bunch of people in Japan doing those things to help American companies. So that was it. Let the gentleman back here ask a question.
Much that you've said tonight reinforces the contention that I've made for a long time, that we need more students in this country studying Japanese culture and Japanese language. that, for example, we have so few people in either on government or private industry in Japan looking out for American interests and that are conversant in Japanese things and in Japanese language. And moreover, I believe it's true that even in our own government, we have hardly any Japanese specialists with economics specialization who speak Japanese and know Japan. And I wonder, being at a university here in Baltimore, where Japanese is not taught, for that matter, Japanese is not taught in a single university in Baltimore, and we're one of the Baltimore's in the top 10 or 12 cities in the United States in population. And here we have a situation where there is not a single university that offers Japanese. I wonder if there is some input that TRW and other industries that realize the need for this can make to help persuade our institutions of the need to implement and initiate programs of Japanese language and help to persuade and make the case for it, and also to help hire those people who do get Japanese.
Now you really put the spanner in the works at the end. Let me answer the first part of your question, and then that last line is one of the big problems. The White House apparently has an initiative underway in this very area. The American Electronics Association is sending, financed by American companies, the first set of American engineering type students to Japan for language study. North Carolina State University has a program that's been in existence a couple years to do this sort of thing. MIT has a program that's beginning, same field. There are some efforts underway, and I think American industry is going to step up to the subject, probably initially on Japanese, and then it'll suddenly wake up that maybe they need to do it on Chinese too. So that part's easily answered. The second part is a very difficult situation which many of us have encountered in our workaday lives. That is, if you become a specialist, if you become a Japanese language specialist, it becomes very difficult to advance in management. If you become a specialist in anything, it becomes difficult to advance in generalist. I was going to do Slavic studies at one point in my sordid career, and the professor said, "You'll die, you'll become a specialist, you'll never get to tell anybody what to do, they'll always be telling you." Interestingly enough, even as a generalist, somebody tells you what to do. But that's a real problem. It's a real problem because you create a cadre now. Let's say over the next 10 years, we create a cadre. Let's even say we got it up to 1,000, which would be a lot of people that would be fluent in Japanese. Because at least one source I've read says there are only 1,500 true foreigners in the world that can both speak fluently and write Japanese. It is one of the most limited foreign language expertise in the world. Remember, I said fluently and I said speak and read. We do, and in the U.S. government for commercial purposes, there are only 2 lead people that speak Japanese and that have lived in Japan, and there's 1 junior person, and there might be another one hiding. But that's the U.S. Trade Representative in the Department of Commerce out of maybe 40 or 50 people that are connected. But if I can flip the coin for just a second, one of the real ironies is I was at a Japan-California Association meeting somewhat like this, and a gentleman who's known to be fluent in Japanese, and we were having one of these round table type discussions, turned to the Japanese side and he said, "It doesn't help me a bit that I speak Japanese because you won't let me become part of what you're talking about, and you don't let me become part of your culture. And I'm still on the outside." Now that doesn't mean we shouldn't do the very things you said. Don't misunderstand me. But there are some immense hurdles to get over, and one of my good Japanese friends told me, he said, "You know, one of the real problems I have is that every time I meet a gaijin foreigner who is fluent in Japanese, he says, I find they are such horrible people." He says, "I think it's because they can really express themselves clearly to me, and I don't understand gaijins as well in English." So, let me can I take another question? Is that okay? Yes.
We've heard so much about Japan's business miracle, and yet last month in the Evening Sun, they had an article that said Japan has got an enormous federal debt that it's much larger in proportion to the population than any other country. And if they are so terribly successful in what they do, why have they got this enormous debt?
This is a problem that Shina-san has to live with. I'm waiting for it to finally come home. The big national debt that all the Japanese businessmen talk about it too. I say, this is terrible. There's apparently the regular budget, which is what we read about in the papers, and there's a special budget. And at any rate, it just hasn't come home to roost yet. Part of it is because the public itself is basically a large saver of its income. So 23 to 30%, depending on who you read, of the total public income is banked. And most of it is banked in the government deposits, in postal savings accounts at very low interest rates. And that influences, it makes this phenomena drag on longer than in the United States because there's a source of liquidity, there's a source of cash at low interest rates to finance both government projects and also the private sector to some extent. So you're absolutely right in what you've read, I'm sure. It's a process that takes time to come home to roost, and it hasn't reached disequilibrium yet. So what you read is true. Every Japanese businessman I know talks about the burgeoning national debt of Japan. Okay. Thanks again. I really appreciate it.
I know many of you still have questions, and it's important that an audience feels that way. And I know that you recognize Mr. Osborn as has a wealth of knowledge which you could take advantage of. I'm also reminded of some of the great orators of the recent past, like President Sukarno of Indonesia, who used to, after 1 hour or so, become mildly interested in his subject, and after 2 hours would warm to it, and after 3 hours he'd be very, very strong, and in the 4th hours he was extraordinary. And the unfortunate thing is, I think our speaker tonight would be quite willing to answer your questions and deal with these matters for 4 hours. And however, we do have a time limit which we unfortunately have to impose both upon the audience and upon our guest, to whom we are very grateful for his adroit performance and for sharing the evening with us and enlightening